Hi everyone. Uh, Today we're going to talk about function concepts and specifically we're going to learn why functions are very powerful constructs in the programming language, and what are the main elements of a function, and then we're going to get to a very simple example of actually implementing a function. So now if we think about what we've done in the course so far, there have been many examples of where we've used functions. So for example, here are some examples of functions we've used. So we have rand_range, for instance, which gives us a random number in a given range. We have the square root function that's defined in the math module, and perhaps the first function we've used is the input function. So these are examples of functions we've used. So we're going to look at how we're actually going to write our own functions. Now, before we could look at that, I'd like to get you to think a little bit about what are the advantages of functions. So just by being able to call a function, what we're essentially doing is we're able to reuse code that's already been defined, that's already been implemented, and we could just reuse it by calling it. So instead of having to rewrite the function every single time, we just call it, and without having to worry about the details of how it's implemented. Now, so that's one main advantage of functions, is the idea of code reuse. The second advantage of functions is that it allows us to structure our program into reusable units of execution. So then that allows us to develop more efficiently. So that's the other advantage. Now let's look at an example, quick example of calling a function. So let's suppose we have this code. We've imported random, and then we get to this point where we call this function rand_range. And so what happens here? So the rand_range is defined in the random module. So let's suppose we have this representation of the random module, and then we're going to represent rand_range as a square inside random. Now, rand_range has code, Python code, that generates a random number in that range. So it implements some logic that gives us a random range in a specified random number in a specified range. So when we call the function, what essentially happens is that execution of our Python program transfer over to the code that's defined in rand_range, and in the process we send those two values, 1 and 7, are transferred over to rand_range, the function. Now the function executes, and after it generates a random number within the range, it returns the value, which in this case we store in the variable called row. So in essence, so there are three elements to this. So the first is that there's transfer of control. And all that really means is that, Python executes code within the rand_range function once we call it. So that's the first thing. The second aspect of a function is that there's the possibility of sending values to the function. So this is what we're doing here. So 1 and 7 are examples of arguments that we send to the function. And actually in the definition of the function rand_range, these arguments are referred to as parameters. So we'll go back to that later, but I just want to introduce these terms. So parameters versus arguments, this will become clearer later. But for now, just remember that they exist. So we could send values to function, and the function. So then once the function executes, once it's done executing, it has the ability to send us back some value. So the function returns some value. And now neither step 2 nor 3 are required, so these are optional, but in essence they define a way, a flow of data into the function. This is what the arguments are, so flow in, and then return value is flow out. And then once the value is returned, then Python executes the next statement that we have, which in this case outputs the value. So again, these are 3 elements of a function. The number 2 and 3 are optional, but in all cases there is a transfer of control, which means that the code inside the function is executed when we call the function. Okay, so now we're ready to actually work with an example, and then we're gonna look at a bare bone example. We're gonna implement a function that doesn't have any parameters, doesn't have any arguments, and doesn't return anything. But it's still, it's a simple function, but it does something. It's not trivial. And the first function we're gonna write is called print stars. And what the function is gonna do is output a 5x5 grid of asterisks. So that's what it's gonna output. So every time we call this function, it's gonna produce this pattern. So let's see how we... Okay, so we're gonna implement this function, print stars. So here's what the implementation is gonna look like. So in order to implement a function, we introduce the def keyword. So def, short for defining. So we're gonna define print stars. And after we specify the name of the function, we're gonna put a blank set of parentheses and a colon. And then now in the next line, starting here, is the body of the function, which is essentially, all the statements that we want it to execute when we call the function. So in order to, print out this pattern of stars, what we're gonna do is use a nested loop. So I'm gonna say for I in range 5, and for j in range 5, so that gives me the 5x5. Then I'm gonna say print the asterisk, and I'm gonna put space after each asterisk. So now the inner loop, lines 3 and 4, essentially print a line of asterisks, a line of stars, and then the outer loop, line 2, allows me to repeat this process 5 times, and that's how I end up with 5 lines of asterisks. But at the end of after the inner loop, I want to go to the next line so that not all the stars are output on the same line. So now I'm gonna execute this block, and as you noticed, when you execute it, I didn't get an error, so that's good. There are no syntax errors in here. But at the same time, this didn't produce any output because I have not called the function. So now I'm gonna actually call the function. So to call it, it's very simple. So I'm just going to say print stars and execute, and there we go. We have our 5x5 pattern of stars. And so this illustrates the fact that we could reuse the code by simply calling the function. And when I call it, again, I don't have to worry about how it was implemented. I just need to know how to call it, and that's sufficient. And then the function is named meaningfully, so the person who's using it has an idea of what it's actually going to do. And here we go. I could call it as many times as I want. I could call it again if I'd like, and it will output another set of, another block of stars. So this is our first example of functions, and then we're gonna build on that to see how we could introduce parameters and arguments to the function, so we could pass inputs to the function, and then later we're gonna look at examples of actually returning a value from a function. So that's coming up in the next video. All right, thank you.